As communicators, we have a chance to rewrite the narrative on Indigenous equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. What are some ways one could go about doing this?
Yeah, I mean, as Julie said before, challenging the status quo. Just because we do things one way doesn't mean we have to keep walking that same path. We all live and work in this system of social constructs created for us to exist within, and it seems most of the time those systems don't include love or leading with your heart, as I mentioned before. I've been taught to weave with love into everything that I do, and those and I'm very expressive of that in the workplace. I think it's my responsibility to change the narrative on how we conduct work, and to shift away from this colonial way of doing things that focus on like individualism, the hierarchy and indulgence. But when we can shift the narrative and shift the story to exist within the Indigenous worldview, I think just knowing that we're all connected and we are all one, and we're doing the right thing for the collective, I think that we can naturally begin to include the voices of Indigenous people, marginalized voices, as you mentioned, Asna, like with the Black Lives Matter movement. If we're doing things kind of in a way with love, I think we can begin to honor and include those diverse perspectives, and in a way of Indigenous voices. We can include elders and knowledge keepers and youth, and just making sure we continue to do things in a good way. And I think for many of us that's changing, but I think there's a lot of times where we need to shift from requiring an Indigenous voice as a checkbox, having an Indigenous person come to do a territory acknowledgement, or having an elder do an open. Although those are incredible things to include, I think that we need to shift from having those people there as token as tokens, and begin to ask more questions and have genuinity and curiosities and authenticity in inviting those voices to the conversation. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. Juli, would you like to say anything to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It was an interesting, even thinking about what we would say in this talk today. I know that Nicole and I, in our first conversation, we're just really grappling with the role of a communicator and our perspectives as Indigenous employees, and just it's difficult for us to think about how we uncouple that, because we experience things as Indigenous people and we're also employees. How can I give meaningful insight to everybody that's here today who maybe is not Indigenous but is interested in supporting Indigenous equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace? And so that got me thinking too. So if we're looking at an organization holistically, and we're thinking about what HR is doing to support EDI initiatives around Indigenous people, so we're recruiting Indigenous people to come and work for us, but then once they get there, if the experience is less than ideal, I think that's really an opportunity for communicators to be able to help do some of the work. So I know as an Indigenous employee, I've primarily worked in Indigenous sectors, so I haven't run into these issues always, but I have worked in a non-Indigenous sector. I worked at the university, Thompson Rivers University, for a while, and it was interesting to me because I had never been put in that position where I was the only Indigenous person in the room. And I found that to be emotionally draining at times, where people wanted my perspective because they had never met somebody like me. And so that's not something that I was necessarily getting paid for. That wasn't a part of the job description, but that became a big part of my job. People asking questions, friendships that I made, and people feeling like they were safe and they could ask questions that they maybe had never asked. So I think for communicators to understand that that emotional labor is being done, and it's being done by Indigenous employees. And so if you want to foster environments where Indigenous people feel safe, then you need to help do, I would strongly encourage you to help do some of that heavy lifting, thinking about how you create a safe and supportive environment for Indigenous people. And when there are initiatives where you're wanting Indigenous perspectives, they really think about how you make that inclusion meaningful. And you're not really wanting to extract knowledge just to better your own area of work. I think you should really be asking the question, what are we doing as an organization? What are we doing or not doing that makes you feel safe and supported or not? And I think that's an interesting conversation to have. And when we work on creating that environment where people will feel safe, they'll stay. And if we don't, and if we can't support that, then they'll leave. And then all of that recruitment effort was for nothing. And so I think the role of communicators is to really help do some of that work, be mindful of the lived experiences that Indigenous people have, and be willing to share some of that load.
That's great. That's so valid. Thank you so much for that. Before I continue, I just want to apologize for some of the feedback you might be hearing on my end. My laptop is old and the fan is very over enthusiastic. Apologies about that. I will keep myself on mute unless I absolutely have to speak. Okay. Before we move on to the next question, Nicole, would you like to maybe respond to what Juli said? I know we've spoken before and you've had a lot to say on this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel the emotional labor sometimes too, and I think in a similar way, you know, it's a lot of work, and although I love being that person that people can come to and talk to, and that's part of my job, you know, to educate my team and to educate in different ways around Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous ways of doing things and protocols. But it can be taxing, you know, you're the token Indigenous person in the team, or you know, I know in our institution there's not many Indigenous staff, and there's only a handful of Indigenous faculty members. And so in a large organization, that's not a lot of people to call on. And I know that I'm even calling on different Indigenous faculty and staff at SFU to you know, run ideas by, and they're so busy too. So I think that it's important that the non-Indigenous communicators and team members have those curiosities to learn about Indigenous histories, Indigenous worldview, Indigenous protocols, and be able to, like Juli said, share that load, because it can take a lot out of you. And you can only do so much. And with regard to reconciliation and decolonization, I think a big part of that is the non-Indigenous people in the room also starting to stand up and use their voice towards reconciliation.
Okay, my next question I will pose to Juli and Nicole as well. Juli, I know you spoke about working with First Nations and introducing communications as a career option for First Nations youth. Would you mind sharing a bit about your experiences and learnings from that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think, well, a part of the reason I did my thesis is that First Nations are the only governments in Canada that don't actually receive core funding for communications. And when you think about the scope of work that First Nations have to deal with, they're dealing with issues on a municipal, provincial, and federal level. They're often small communities that are strapped for resources, and they don't have a communications function. And you think about how desperately or how much we as communicators are called upon, even within our own organizations, to make sure that things are flowing well. And you think about all of the stakeholders that First Nations have to actually engage with, not just their community members, but their provincial and federal partners, partner organizations, industry. It's pretty big. And when there's not a communications function within a First Nation administration, and kids that are only growing up in communities, remote communities, that they are only exposed to the jobs that they see. And if they see jobs uh, in the community, like maybe there's social workers and health and family workers and lawyers and people in the band administration, they don't really get that sense where there could be somebody like me or Nicole and like all of us where we have an interest and a passion in storytelling or design or arts. And I think it's just so important to to expose First Nations youth to this industry, this sector, and let them know that you can actually find a very rewarding career in doing things that you're naturally good at. But they first have to know that they're there, that those opportunities are there for them so that they can prepare themselves for this type of career. And then they also have to have that space to foster their career growth. So there needs to be opportunities for First Nations youth to be able to experience what it's like to be a communications person. And there's only a handful of, well, probably more than a handful, but I don't know. I mean, I've been doing this work for just over maybe around 15 years, and I can count on my hands the number of Indigenous communicators I know in this province. There's very few of us, and I would just love to be able to look down the road one day and see more of us and more in youth knowing that their skill sets that they have in storytelling and arts, that there's an outlet there that can actually be quite a rewarding career.
Thank you. Okay, my next question is related to the work of a communicator. So how can a communicator work with the delicate balancing act of resisting colonialism and operating within colonial institutions? And I will throw this out to either of you, Juli and Nicole.
Juli, you wanna take this first?
Sure. I guess, how can a communicator? It's hard for me to separate my experience as a communicator with the experience of being an Indigenous employee. But I think some of the things that when I think about some of the things where I've had to resist colonialism in working in an organization, there's things that you just, like my example is I once had a colleague ask me what I was doing to celebrate Canada Day when we had a long weekend. And I said, it's not really a day I celebrate. And nothing against people that do celebrate it. And I'm also, my opinion isn't reflective of all other First Nations people, but just for me, I don't see it as a celebratory thing. I take it as a moment to reflect on what we are celebrating. But it's just that it's that resisting where everybody, like what I said, when you're the only Indigenous person in the department and everyone is talking about what they're doing to celebrate these days or to do these things, it is really hard to kind of challenge that status quo and say, it means something different to me than it does to you. And there are little things like that come up. For instance, I don't wear a wedding ring because I actively choose to resist colonialism in the ways that I can. And even that conversation, when you're like in a casual conversation where you're talking about wedding rings fitting or not fitting, or why you wear this or why you've gotten a tattoo as opposed to a ring, and then I say that, it just changes the conversation. And so I think that's what we're looking for, is that diversity of thought, and yeah, it's just it's a difficult thing, I think, to resist colonialism and operate in those same institutions. And then to that point, I think what the reason we're having this conversation today is because we're trying to figure it out, but none of us know what it's like to live in decolonized Canada, and we're just, yeah, figuring it out together.
Yeah, I'll follow that. I think we are all just having to be really patient in working in these colonial structures. I know I've been dealing with some, there's running into policies that are in place that, whether it was intended or not, that were created to not include Indigenous or marginalized voices in their perspectives, this colonial structure and system that, I think as Indigenous communicators, we're working towards systems change, but that's really hard. And having patience is probably the most key part of that, although it can be really, really frustrating. I think that this role, and kind of touching on the last question that we were both talking about, is having those hard conversations and letting the non-Indigenous people try and take the load. But I think having hard conversations should be received with passion or compassion. Sorry. I think there's a lot of times, and I've seen recently, that the hard questions or hard conversations that kind of relate to the colonial institutions are received with anger or defensiveness, and I think sometimes make those structures a little bit more solid, and sometimes it doesn't. Maybe they can be broken down, but I think that there's opportunity to work within the institutions to inspire curiosity and have people brave enough to challenge assumptions, and I think there's a lot of defensiveness around the institutions and how, again, how things have always been, and people's unconscious bias and defensiveness comes when we're challenging those things. So working and operating within the colonial institution can be a challenge. And yeah, I think the best way is to approach it with compassion and patience, and try to work against it, while also just educating people around the fact that we are in these colonial institutions, and yeah, and they're challenging for all people, and especially people of marginalized communities.